Hi, I'm Andre J, and welcome to another episode of Video Feedback Techniques. Today, we are going to talk about what you can do with two cameras. There's actually kind of a lot you can do with this kind of a setup, because once you add another camera and another screen to the mix, things start to get extra complicated in how many different ways you can arrange the things and mix them together and meld them and whatnot. So I'm definitely not going to be able to get to like every single thing you can do. Nor am I even going to like pretend that I know every single thing that you can do with this kind of a setup. But I'll just try to like go through some of the fundamental basics and show you some established fun things that I know that I can do, and then maybe at some point y'all can let me know in the comments if you have any other suggestions or ideas for this kind of thing, because I think the two camera setup, we could probably do a bunch of different ones on this. But first off, let me go get my signal diagram. And I'm probably going to start hosting these with annotations elsewhere, probably on my website, because at a certain point it's really handy to have stuff like this around, and I don't want to just be like having that be like limited to just being in the tiny corner of a thing, and I also don't want to edit these at all. I don't like to edit. That is a pretty fundamental part of how I do video work, is making sure I try to do almost all of it like as live as possible, whether it's video art or whether it's this kind of a thing, because you know what? Editing takes time, rendering takes time, and who's got time? I mean, kind of a lot of people right now because of quarantines, but I'm still pretty busy, yo. But yeah, so just to explain this current setup, what I've got is two cameras, two screens, two mixers. And I'm going to keep using two cameras, two screens, and the same two cameras, same two screens, and the same two mixers for this whole thing. And probably in a future one, I will do a couple other variations with different mixers, or just one mixer and two cameras, because that, actually later on, the second part of this one, I'll do one mixer with two cameras and show you what we do with that. But yeah, so you can see this diagram here is sort of how I like to arrange things for when I actually like need to remember something and set it back up again. I have like the mixers, the screens, I have little wiggly lines that show that there's some sort of light information traveling between the things. And then down in the mixers, I have like a separate text thing that says what the settings are on the mixer for A and B, how things are being blended, what sort of effects, what sort of processing is on this. Part of the one mixer I'm using today has a proc amp in it, a processing amp, which means I can play around with values of like the light. Essentially, I wanted to have this because it makes it easier for me to like fine-tune light controls for this video. You don't need a proc amp in your video setup, though they're very awesome and very useful. And I'm definitely working on a digital processing amp for video things that will be open source and also purchasable at some point in the near future. So if you're interested in doing this kind of stuff and you don't have a processing amp, then that's something to look for, I guess. But yeah, so my first camera over here, I just shut it down. I have my trusty old RCA camcorder running through the Panasonic MX70, which is the processing amp, and it's going out through a pretty large consumer-grade CRT. And I dialed up the sharpness on the CRT because I wanted to get some more of the line things happening. Let me turn off the... So this is pretty much what's coming out of the first camera. It's just light. There's a big light blob in the middle, and it descends into like warm worms on the outside. And then here's the other camera. This is being processed, so the output from the MX70 is coming into my Roland V4, and then I have a JVC tube camera, single tube camera, pointed at a CRT, which is grabbing the RGB, the VGA signal out from the Roland. So I wanted to use this one just because I wanted to experiment more with this CRT, the VGA signal CRT. This one, it's a Trinitron monitor. It's probably the heaviest not the heaviest, but it's the heaviest CRT I own that I can lift out of everything else. I have bigger CRTs, but they're lighter. I do have one larger CRT, which is heavier than all of them, and it is the largest, as far as I can tell, the largest CRT in the world. And I cannot lift that at all. I think it probably weighs 3 or 4 times what I do. So that would be interesting if I could. But yeah, so I have this set up right here. I dialed it in because I wanted there to be a lot of light blobs in the middle that I can key into, and also some sort of detail around the edges. And then, so what I'm doing is I'm going to I'm using Luma Key into white on the mixer that's compositing the 2 videos. So you can just watch what happens as I dial up Luma Key into white. So you can see it's grabbing. I tried to dial it in. I wanted to have a little bit of an outline happening because I like the way that looks. It preserves this sort of wormy things happening. And then, that's what happens if I turn off. Oh yeah, I have the JVC tube camera on the VGA out of the Roland is inverted as well. And actually, let me see. I dialed in something the other day that was. I did want to try monochroming this one as well. Does this work? No, it doesn't work. Because this specific monitor has some weird. It's great for rescanning. The color on it is interesting though. It's not always my favorite one to use for feedback, but it is very crisp, and I like the fact that the darks are so dark on it. It is a thing with a lot of feedback screens where like they're really, really bright, and there's just like a lot of specularity happening all over the place. And I like how dark this one is. This one has some of the deepest blacks out of any screen that I own. But yeah, so we have this thing. It's pretty fun, and you can try moving the one camera around, and you can see you're steering the feedback inside of the other one. You can try moving both cameras around. And that's pretty nifty too. And then you can see what happens if I start playing around with the proc amp thing on this and dialing up and down the brightness values. I can get into something that might trigger some sort of, what do you call it, the auto exposure on this camera to sort of like cycle a bit, which is a pretty good setting to get into. If you have auto exposure on a camera and you can trigger that, what you get is sort of like another kind of cyclical behavior that happens. So, I'm going to start messing around with these things and see if I can get a nice blobby auto exposure thing happening. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's a pretty nice setting too, where I've dialed up the Luma Key, so it's only Luma Keying into one color over here. So the blue is basically the brightest thing on the screen right now, but the red is a little bit darker, so it'll make like a red outline on things. So here's another neat thing you can do when you have like a dual setup like this is, so I'm going to take the output from the MX70 in the Roland, and I'm going to invert it before, and you can see the way that this processor works is as I invert it, it's basically like, it's still keying into the same brightness values. See, the keying doesn't change. Inverting happens after the keying. So I can basically invert it, and it'll change how the second camera is working, how it's functioning with it, but I'm still keying into the same part. So that's pretty rad. Play around with the settings a little bit more so I can get something that sort of like keeps moving around on this side of the screen. That's pretty rad. And then let me see what happens if I I don't know if I've ever gone into this in one of these before, using a strobe. Strobes can be really handy, especially with dual feedback systems. Let me just show you what happens with the strobe over here. So it's just strobe in this case is sort of like a sample and hold, and you can see it's sampling and holding the first camera feed, but the feed that I'm feeding into it is still going in real time. Once I do the one that'll be about dual internal feedback systems, I think that'll be where the strobe really comes in super, super handy. We can also do stuff like if I want to have this sort of what do we got here? Ha 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 ha! Not that one. We can do interesting mirror things. So you'll notice when you do mirroring, and if you're mirroring while you're doing feedback, you get a fundamentally different thing happening if you're mirroring external to the feedback chain. So this is a very sort of like, this looks like something with like oscillators, right? So that's an interesting thing to note, is that you can use mirroring external to your feedback chain to sort of make video oscillators out of video feedback. So that's pretty interesting. I really like the color things that are happening here. Let's see what happens if I reverse that. Yeah, the color's still pretty awesome. And then here's a different kind of mirroring option happening here. I like the inverted a little bit better. And then we can do some kaleidoscope style things happening here. So this is mirroring horizontal and vertical at the same time. There we go. That's a sweet spot right there. And then we can also try Luma Keying into black. So I'm going to need to dial the settings differently for that. Here we are, Luma Keying into black. You'll note I still have, do I still have this inverted? I do. Let me try non-inverting it and then Luma Keying into black and see what kind of things we get. Oh, that's pretty awesome. So what I'm doing is I'm just steering the feedback on the main screen, and that's sort of making everything, oh whoa. And that's steering it's having like a cascading effect on the other one, as you can see. So what happens if I turn off inversion on that? Oh, that's pretty nice too. Now I'm steering both of them. Kind of control how the first camera feed interferes with the second one just by if I just move it so it doesn't show up in wherever the horizontal vertical mirroring trigger happens, then we get that sort of a thing. Yeah, so this is pretty neat. So now let's think about what'll happen if I instead try to Luma Key into the second camera feed, or the first camera feed into the second one. So I'm just sort of sticking with the Roland here as my main compositing unit, and I'm going to start from the other feed and try to Luma Key in from there. So let me make sure I get this thing like reasonably centered over here, because you want to have your main feed that you are, whatever main feed you're compositing from, you want to make sure it doesn't just like blank out at any point. So that means you want that feed to be like reasonably centered. And it's my usual technique for centering, as I may have said before, is just invert the thing. As you can see, this is very far from perfectly centered. This is a tube camera though, so we do know that you can't really get the straight lines from a tube camera. But if you get something close enough, just like the fact that it'll like blur the light together will do a significant amount for you. But yeah, so let us keep all these settings the same, and then maybe let's try black Luma Key and see what happens. So fade it over to this one, and I'm going black Luma Key in. Here we are. Holy crap. So you can see order of operations makes a huge difference here. Wow. So I'm definitely like, I think people have definitely like pointed out to me, I'm very, very pretty intense about how much I like these kind of like symmetric compositions. But part of it is also I really like to do symmetric compositions that also have asymmetric aspects. So this is a pretty nice way to do that, where you have like one very symmetric feed that's interfering with a very asymmetric feed. And I really like the way it's sort of like the spatialization of the things that are happening here. It's pretty astounding, for me anyway. What happens if I turn off the invert on that? Oh yeah, just makes it blobbier. What if I do some color inversion on this? Yeah, color inversion sometimes tends to kill it on this screen. But if I do color and brightness inversion, here we go. Yeah, here's some crazy stuff. And then what if I mirror the first one and not the second one? What happens when I do that? I did a really minimal amount of preparing for this. I mean, I did kind of a lot of preparing for this, but then like once I actually got here, and then I was like, got started, I was like, oh yeah, definitely got to ad-lib a bunch of this stuff. Once you have the setups, it's hard not to. And if we mirror, you can see what happens when we mirror them both. It's a little bit less interesting to me anyway. You turn the mirror off on the tube camera feed and keep the mirror on the first one. Actually, let's lose the mirror on the first one too and see what happens. And then I could try inverting the feed from the MX70 as well. Turn off the inversion on this one. Yeah, you might recognize this one. This one looks a little bit like the psychokinesis mode. Wow. And then what happens if I Luma Key into white on this one? It's like not a heck of a lot. Not enough white. I need to give this one some more white. Anything happening on this one? Yeah, there's kind of nothing really happening over here. I don't think Luma Key into white is going to work on this specific setup. What if I try inverting the MX70 feed? Here we go. Let's invert that. I'm going to turn off the color on the MX70 feed, because I just want to have black and white to work with. Oh wow, that's a lot of fun. And maybe I'll try defocus this a little bit too, so I have some larger structures to play with. There we go. I really like this setup right here, where it has like the sort of like large blobs that come in and out. I guess white Luma Key on this isn't really going to do a heck of a lot. Let me try the black Luma Key again. Yeah, so this screen is just a little bit too dark for what's going on out here. I can maybe try dialing up the brightness and see... Oh, there we go. It's kind of neat. Oh. Oh, wow. This is some pretty interesting juxtaposition here. Yeah, so far it doesn't seem to be getting quite enough brightness from this one to really, like, do a lot. So that's just something you have to keep in mind. Like, it's just not always going to work out the way you hoped it would. Let me try. And then another thing you can do is just try mixing them together. Just try blending. I don't think it's going to work great with this kind of setup. Let me dial up the brightness. So the Roland has a really nice dialing up the brightness thing where you can just kind of like turn that up on the end of the chain. And that's actually pretty cool. I didn't try this one when I rehearsed. Makes like a really nice sort of like neon thing happening over everything. I guess while I'm at it, I might as well just, I'm going to not change I'll probably go into another episode where the next episode, I'll take the two cameras and mix them in on the same mixer. We'll sort of see what different things that adds to the whole thing. But I guess while I'm at it here, I might as well just try a couple more of these, like, some fun things to see what happens. I'm turning up the Mosaic on this. Mosaic on the MX70, which is a more, how do you say it, flexible kind of pixelization thing happening. And then, oh yeah, let me check about color pass. There's a weird thing on this thing which is called a color pass. The V4 has something called color... Is it color pass? No, colorize. That's the one I want to use. It's not really, generally speaking, not the most useful thing I've found, but every now and then it comes in really handy. Colorizers are pretty fun. Maybe I should just do, like, I would like to do an episode on colorizers. I try not to make these into, like, advertisements for things that I make, because that's one of those, like, really obnoxious things when you, like, look at, like, an instructional video on YouTube and then, like, the whole thing is just, like, oh yeah, and then you can fucking buy this over on Newark.com or whatever. Like, the whole thing is just like, you know, like, it has educational value, but the whole thing is really just like geared towards like advertising. And I would like to, generally speak, try to like separate these from advertising. The flip side of that is that the only colorizer that I have is one that I made. But I guess I don't sell the colorizer. The colorizer is just like an open source thing, so it's probably alright if I just like explain colorizers on here, right? I mean, I can do whatever the heck I want, as long as like my principles are generally okay with it, so I guess I'll just think about that one for a moment. Yeah, the wild world of YouTube educational advertisement, the sponsored content. Like, who doesn't love some nice, like, low-key, high-key sponsored content in their daily life? I mean, I don't know. I guess a lot of people do really like that. A lot of people feel like advertisement is like legitimate information. Like, I don't. I guess it's not always the worst. I was just looking up like FPGA boards the other day, and like there was actually reasonably decent advertisement on it. I was doing a lot of research on ADCs and DACs, and a lot of that information on the internet there too is also very like hardcore, like, what do you call it? It's very hardcore, geared towards like sponsored nonsense or whatever. Sponsored nonsense. Sponsored content. I really like this kind of like cellular automata situation happening here, though. So what I'm doing right now is I have the one channel on the MX70, I have A and B bus on the MX70, both taking the same camera feed in. And then I'm just blending in between the one that's really heavily processed and one that's just like a pass-through. So here's pass-through on the MX70. It's just doing some classic Q cycling. There's kind of some really neat little liminal points in the middle here. And then I'll sort of do the fade on both of them, and we can see, like, that's pretty awesome. So I'm just fading between channels right now, too. The nice thing, you can use fades and keys at the same time for softer keying. Yeah, I think that is about it for this installment of 2-camera feedback, and I'll see you back. If you're going to watch these in order, I'll see you in the next one where I mix them both in the same mixer. Alright, cool. Have fun.